So here we are at the beginning of Unit 4. Unit 4 is land and water use. So we're going to talk about land use in Chapter 12. We're going to talk about freshwater use in Chapter 15. And we're going to talk about saltwater or marine ecosystems in Chapter 16. So let's get started. Turn on my laser pointer. So Chapter 12 is forests, forest management, and protected areas. So we're going to talk about how the land is used. So we're going to look at the importance of forests, the current and historical scales of deforestation, how we can find some kind of sustainability between harvesting timber and letting it grow. We can discuss forest management, because there is a strategy to maintaining forests. We can look at public lands that federal land management agencies manage, and we're going to talk about parks and protected areas. So the case study here is dealing with the Amazon rainforest. So a fifth of the Amazon rainforest is gone. Most of it is within Brazil. They are moving into the Amazon rainforest to deal with urban overcrowding and poverty. Back when I was in high school, we learned about what was going on in the Amazon. They were doing slash and burn agriculture, which we'll talk about down the line, in order to create agricultural land for like the fast food companies. So clearing the Amazon rainforest in order to make grazing land for beef for McDonald's. That stopped a while ago. Cattle ranching still is the reason why, as I had mentioned. So there is what it looks like cleared for agriculture. All right, there's still a bunch left, but a lot of it is cattle ranching. So the Brazilian leaders, fueled by international rage and upsetment over the destruction of the Amazon rainforest, created the Forest Code, which requires 80% landowners to conserve 80% of their land. It is eroded over the course of time. So the area of forest destroyed has gone up over time. So, Captain Obvious statement, what's a forest? A forest is any ecosystem with a high density of trees. As we learned in Unit 2, there are a bunch of different kinds of forest biomes. So the boreal forest, or the taiga, the tropical forest, rainforest, temperate deciduous, where we live, the temperate rainforest in the Pacific Northwest, and the tropical dry forest. They're all called forests because trees are the predominant plant species, but different kinds of soil and climate will create variations in the types of communities that you see. So forests are classified based on their primary tree species. So the Maple Beech birch forest in Michigan is made up of maple, beeches, and birch. Okay, the ponderosa pine forest is ponderosa pines. Redwood forest in California, same idea. About a third of the Earth's land surface, give or take, is covered by forests. So they are definitely important in terms of land area coverage. And they provide a lot of ecological complexity. There's a bunch of different habitats or niches within the forest itself. And you guys have probably learned about the canopy, the subcanopy, the understory, all that when you learned about rainforests, probably somewhere in elementary school. We don't need to deal with the specifics of each of these, but each level in the forest has a unique habitat to it. Okay, talking about the understory and the forest floor. Okay, the dead and dying trees here, these are called snags, and they provide a lot of homes for insects, which then provide food sources for birds. We had a bunch of snags at the front of my house and they're dead ash trees from the emerald ash borer. And the pileated woodpeckers used to love to be out front there and just digging out all the bugs. The other thing that happens when you have a tree that dies and falls, you get something called a tree fall gap. We talked earlier when we talked about succession that tree fall gaps are where you get secondary succession happening. There's a change in the species that are there, and then you have shade intolerant plants that start to grow here. Okay, so you get early successional plants. Ecosystem services. Let's go back. What are ecosystem services? They are things, services that fully, completely functioning ecosystems provide for humans. Ecosystem services are things for humans. So what do trees and forests do? They stabilize soil. Okay, they help in mineral cycling. Stabilizing soil is really important because they have roots that go down deep. The leaves and the leaf litter slow down the runoff rather than it running off like we talked about in a previous chapter. So that allows water to infiltrate, and then it increases water content in the soil, which is good for the rest of the plants. And then eventually, if there's enough of it, it's going to recharge aquifers, which is really good. They are huge filters, right? Some people refer to the Amazon as the lungs of the planet, okay? So they do a lot of pollution filtration. They take in carbon dioxide through the process of photosynthesis and produce the oxygen, okay? So we need these trees because they are great carbon dioxide sinks. They absorb it. And then you get that kumbaya part of ecosystem services. They provide cultural, aesthetic, and recreation values to people. People go out and hike. It's just a beautiful, calming place to be. And I kind of alluded to this before. They store an estimated roughly 300 billion metric tons when you cut down those forests. That carbon dioxide that was in them, if the trees are burned or allowed to decompose naturally, that carbon dioxide goes back up into the atmosphere, and then there's less vegetation on the planet to soak it up. So preserving forests is, a win-win situation because, win-win-win, many wins. We have that aesthetic component. We have that carbon cycling component. We have the oxygen that is produced for us. And then there's vegetation to soak up the more carbon dioxide we're putting in the atmosphere. So besides the aesthetic values, we get lots of medicine and dyes and food sources from forests, and we get wood for trees. So we have done a lot of industrial harvesting. So we've become very, very efficient when it comes to our ability to extract timber, potentially to the point of detriment. Most of the boreal forests or the taiga are in Canada or Russia. So a lot of the pine that you can pick up at Home Depot comes from those places. Or some of the harder woods, more expensive woods, are coming from Brazil and Indonesia, who have traditionally had large tracts of rainforest. Captain Obvious statement, again, deforestation is clearing forests more quickly than they can regrow. So there's a net loss of forest. You can harvest from forests, get timber out of forests without causing deforestation. Deforestation is bad. You lose biodiversity because you're getting rid of habitat. Soil degrades because there's nothing to hold the soil in place. You get desertification, again, because you're changing the moisture content because transpiration isn't happening. And it can contribute to climate change because there's nothing to soak up that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So the need for wood and the need for space for agriculture are the big things that are impacting forests right now. Okay, farming and ranching is your agriculture. Mining, we're going to talk about that down the line. where you just clear cut areas and you dig into the ground. Logging and timber management, so not doing a really good job carefully managing your timber. Slash and burn farming, where people go in, this happens a lot in the Amazon rainforest, they go in and they just literally cut down all the trees and burn them to, ash tends to have, be very nutrient rich. So they burn the trees and then the ash goes into the ground as like fertilizer for the soil, and then they grow crops off of it. And wildfires. Most of the wildfires you see, we don't hear about them too much in Asia, but we've heard a lot about them in Australia a few years ago. And they're pretty common in North America. So if we talk about North America in particular, 1620, Pilgrim times, you can see the two different colors here, primary forest and secondary forest. So this is like the native, untouched, natural forest, right? 1620, all of the forest in the United States was primary forest, okay? We came in and we decided to cut down the forest to build our log cabins, to fuel our homes, to do all those things industrial and in the sake of progress. And a lot of the West got deforested for the purpose of agriculture. All right. So most of this primary forest is gone. Okay. And you can see the little dark green spots here. It's not that much. What's left after we realized, oh, no, we really shouldn't be chopping down these forests, is secondary forest. Okay. So it's after secondary succession, right? They didn't, cutting the primary forest did not get rid of the soil, but what it did do is get rid of those trees. So they've allowed the trees to grow back. They're partially mature again, but it's a completely different group of a community, okay? Different climax community than it was back in 1620. In a lot of developing nations, okay, there's a lot of uncut primary forest, but local people are turning to that for harvesting for a bunch of reasons, either because they want to expand human settlement, they need to spread out, like we were talking about in Brazil. They can sell the wood if it's like teak and mahogany, those really expensive rainforest woods, or to provide fuel for heating and cooking for the people. So it's the cheapest, easiest source to use, so that's what they wind up using. It's right there. But they're cutting down primary forests, which is a huge source of biodiversity. It's happening a lot in Indonesia, okay? We're going to talk about what's going on in Indonesia, in South America, in Brazil, and in places in Africa, okay? This shows you the net change in forested regions. So we're conscientiously regrowing a lot of deforested land in the United States, in Russia, in India, and in Europe. China looks like it's, the king of reforestation, but most of what they have planted is monoculture. So monoculture is one single species that is planted. So they are planting a lot of hectares of forest, but it's not native forest. Or if it is native, it's like one species. It's not natural forest. Okay, so there's another picture of that. We talked about this. So this is the same area in Brazil in my lifetime. So in 1975, this is what it looked like. In 2018, this is what it looked like. So when you lose the green and get the white, that is deforested areas. So developing nations can choose to allow large multinational corporations to come in and harvest their timber if those multinational corporations will pay for it. So what winds up happening the developing nations get a pittance, a really small amount of money, then the timber gets exported to wealthier nations where those multinational companies charge a lot more for it. You get short-term economic benefits. You get a little cash flow into your economy, but the longer-term consequences from an environmental perspective can be pretty devastating. So here's an example, and this is the case study. The Amazon rainforest is an interesting case study, but I think this one is more interesting. So this is what's happening in Southeast Asia. They are cutting down huge tracts of tropical rainforest in order to grow palm, which is used for palm oil. It's a biofuel, and it's found in a whole lot of processed foods. We're going to talk about palm oil in our key points a little bit deeper. Okay, so they're taking this beautiful primary forest and they're cutting it down, burning it to make this monoculture of palm oil. So Borneo, one of the islands in Indonesia, the big one, there it is in 1950 and there it is in 2020. So a huge portion of the island, a huge portion of the rainforest has been destroyed to make these palm oil plantations. It's very sad. So if you're destroying this primary forest, you're destroying habitat for all of the species that live within there. One of them is the orangutan. So the case study we have for this is one of the sadder case studies, but it really is pretty impactful. So, okay, where's the balance? Where is the balance between us being able to utilize forests and their resources versus doing it sustainably so as not to impact other species, reduce biodiversity, and the availability of those things for future generations? So we came up with this idea of forestry. You can go to college and major in forestry, and I've had some students do that. It's the practice of managing society's demand for forests against maintaining them as ecosystems. So it's the balance. Forestry, the goal of forestry is to find and maintain that balance. We know that timber, wood, biomass is a renewable resource as long as it's not exploited too rapidly. You need to have time for that resource to grow so it's available for future generations. And we can talk about this with any resources that we talk about. Resource management is the strategy of managing and regulating harvests to make sure that you don't take too much, but there's still enough available for the people that need it. So this is the idea of like quotas and permits and all that stuff when we talked about the tragedy of the commons in the beginning. So if you look at forest growth, okay, or really the growth of any resource species, they find something called maximum sustainable yield, okay? So they want to get the greatest amount of resource out of a forest, a fish stock, anything, right, without depleting that resource. So here we go, logistic growth, woohoo. So you harvest at about the middle of the curve where the growth is the fastest. Okay, if you harvest too early, the growth is too slow and it takes too long to get that resource back. If you harvest too late, then the growth slows down again. So you want to hit it and start that harvest at the fastest growth point. Okay, the upside, you get, the maximum yield that still allows the species to grow, but you only get about half the normal size, right? So the population about doubles between maximum sustained yield and carrying capacity, right? It's about halfway. But that's okay, because it allows us to continue to use the resource without depleting it. One thing, hopefully, that you've learned from this course so far is that if we're going to do things sustainably, we really want to mimic what happens in natural ecosystems. So there's a way of doing it, of managing resources like this. It's called ecosystem-based management, where they, instead of hitting maximum sustainable yield, it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. You have to kind of look at the forest and the systems in the forest to figure out what the best way is to do the harvesting or to manage that resource. But it's really complicated. And, people don't typically agree on it. So we started the idea of a national forest. If you go back to the Manifest Destiny times, right, Lewis and Clark exploring and conquering the West, we went out into the West and cut down oodles and oodles and oodles of trees. Okay, our job, as the philosophy of Manifest Destiny, is that nature is there for us to conquer. So you know what we're going to do? We're going to go out there and we're going to conquer it. Okay, and then we started to realize, oh no, wait a second, this isn't working. We're running out of trees. So that's where the idea of a national forest was developed, out of fear of a timber famine. We were going to cut down all the trees, so let's preserve some of them. All right, so this map shows all of the different areas of land and who they're managed by. So you've got the Bureau of Land Management, which is the purple, which is frankly most of the West. Fish and Wildlife Service, and a good chunk of Alaska. Fish and Wildlife Service is blue. Again, most of Alaska is that. The Forest Service is the green. There's a lot of national forest. And the National Park Service are these brown spots. Okay, so different kinds of land are managed by different land agencies. One of the big problems with this, before I move on, if you notice, and I think we talk about this a little bit later, but I'm going to talk about it now, very little of the West is managed by states. There's not a lot of this whole tan beige color. Most of it is these other colors. So like in Idaho, most of the state of Idaho is national land, federal land. So the people of Idaho can't really do much on it. A lot of Oregon too. So most of the timber harvesting takes place on private land. So in order to do that, they want to hit maximum sustainable yield to maximize those yearly profits. The Forest Service, who manages the national forests, they tend to sell timber below the cost. So taxpayers wind up subsidizing private timber harvesting on public land. So they sell the Forest Service does not sell timber at market value. Okay, so it sells it at a reduced rate. So then the difference is going to companies rather than to the Forest Service. So it's kind of annoying. This is something else that we've done, and this is what's going on in China, which is why China is the darkest green on that net gain or loss for forests map. So typically what's happening now is that they focus on monoculture. Monoculture is one species that's all planted at the same time. Okay, they grow fast. So this is called even-aged trees. So the result of this monoculture that are planted at the same time, you get even-aged trees. So all the trees are the same age. So then you harvest them all at the same time, as opposed to an uneven-aged forest. So what's the downside of even-aged forests? If you have a forest of trees that are all the same age, they don't have the biodiversity because it's all the same habitat, it's all the same niche, right? So you don't have the variety in habitats which perpetrate the increase in biodiversity. And they're really vulnerable to pest insects, right? So you can have fungal infections or diseases or bugs that all want trees of a certain age. And if one little area of the even-aged forest winds up with this disease, or this infestation, it's going to run rampant and destroy the entire forest. Whereas if you have an uneven-aged stand of trees, an uneven-aged forest, you've got a bunch of different ages and a bunch of different species that are more structurally diverse. and they're more resistant to pests and infestations, a lot more habitats, a lot more niches, and is really similar to what a native forest should look like. So if you're going to do forestry, if you're going to plant stands of trees, you want to do this uneven aged thing. And we'll talk about what they actually did in Mount St. Helens after Mount St. Helens erupted in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest when we talk about our key points. So there's a bunch of different ways to harvest trees. The simplest, easiest, and read cheapest method is clear cutting. They have these huge industrial saws, right, attached to a tractor, and they go into the forest and they just cut all of the trees down in a huge swath, and that's what you can see here. All the trees are cut down at once. When this happens, you wind up increasing erosion because you're cutting down a whole bunch of trees in one area. You alter these microclimates. One of the things, if you go back to the water cycle, one of the things that happen in the water cycle related to plants is this idea of transpiration, right? So moisture is released from these trees. That's the plant sweat that I've talked about. So if you clear all of those trees, the moisture content in that area is going to go down because there's no transpiration happening. Okay, so these microclimates, these smaller areas, are going to wind up increasing in temperature because there's no transpiration to move that heat. Okay, which is problematic. Some other ways you could do, they're more selective, right? The seed tree approach is you can leave some seed producing trees to harvest, to reseed the harvested area. So you leave some trees, but then you cut some trees, and then the trees that are left can provide seeds. You can use something called the shelter wood approach, which leaves some mature trees behind to shelter those growing seedlings. So that's another way. And the other idea is a selection system. So selection system is you, instead of doing a clear swath and then planting trees back all at the same time to get the even-aged stand, you do the uneven-aged stand. So you go in and you select certain trees. These systems are expensive, okay, because it's instead of having the big machine that just goes in and mows everything down, you've got to go in and choose the trees, and then you have to have the right equipment to harvest the trees, and then you have to have the right equipment to pull the trees out. And really, in terms of safety risks to the loggers, it is more dangerous, okay, because if you have a tree that doesn't fall the right way, it can hurt people, or it can knock another tree over, which can hurt people. So it's actually a lot more dangerous. And then these are different ways to harvest. It's a visual representation of the different ways that we talked about. Over the last 50 years or so, the U.S. Forest Service has followed a policy called the multiple use policy. Means that forests can be used for a bunch of things, okay? Recreation, habitat, mineral extraction, and other things besides just timber, okay? And then in the 70s, Congress passed the National Forest Management Act, which required the Forest Service to come up with sustainable plans for each of the national forests. So come up with a plan, because there is no one-size-fits-all solution based on, what's available in the forest and, what people want to do with that forest. Come up with a plan for each forest. So the idea of new forestry has helped with that. So you can go in and mimic natural disturbances like a windstorm to allow certain trees to fall. The passing of that law gave us the opportunity to come up with programs to preserve habitats for endangered and non-game species. So, for example, here's the woodpecker. If this is a woodpecker nesting and roosting tree, then this is not one that people can cut down. So, forest fires historically have been seen as a bad thing. So for most of its existence, when the Forest Service saw a fire break out, it suppressed it. It put it out immediately. We now know that fire suppression actually leads to bigger fires, and we're going to talk about why in a few minutes. And that we've learned that fires in the forest are a really important part of the normal functioning of a forest. Okay, some plants will not go to seed unless they are burned. A lot of the trees in the pine barrens are like that. When I was in Australia, a species of yucca plant would not have its seed pods open unless they were burned, and we tried that in a courtyard, and we got the seed pod to open as a result. I'll show you guys some pictures. So how does it lead to? We're going to talk about how it leads to an increase in larger fires. Most of the danger when it comes to wildfires is due to the fact that we are encroaching on the edge of the forested land. They call that the wildland-urban interface. Okay, so forest fires are not bad for forests, but they're bad for homes that are next to forests. And this is a picture of some of the California wildfires and like how dangerous they were to some of these local cities. So why are suppressed areas more dangerous? Okay. If you suppress fire, you get a lot of this fuel load that's underneath. So the scrub trees, the bushes, the pine needles, all that stuff. If you suppress the fire, then you're not letting this little stuff burn, and then there's more fuel to allow the fire to spread. So what the Forest Service has recommended doing now are these things called prescribed burns, where the Forest Service will set intentional small fires to burn up this underbrush and the fuel load, so that way if a larger forest fire breaks out, it doesn't spread as rapidly. And if you didn't know I was a nerd, you're going to find out now. I follow the New Jersey Forest Service page on Facebook, and they will post when they're doing prescribed burns in areas to let people know that, hey, this is not a forest fire you see. We're doing this on purpose in order to prevent the bigger forest fires from spreading. Something else that they can do, they can make laws to allow prescribed burns to happen. You can physically remove underbrush and dead trees according to this Healthy Forests Restoration Act. Or you could do something called salvage logging. So if trees have fallen, you can go in and take the timber out, which also reduces the risk of bigger fires because you're getting rid of that fuel wood. Climate change is making things worse. We wind up with warmer, drier weather in a lot of places, particularly the American West. So what winds up happening, the American West is full of forests, as we saw in one of those earlier maps. Whether it's secondary forest or primary forest, there's a lot of forest out there. The weather is warmer and drier. So we're setting up conditions for forest fires to happen. And there are lots of pest outbreaks because the warmer temperatures are spreading. And it's really not getting super cold in the winters, enough to kill off the larvae of these things. So the pine bark beetles are one example of that. Because a lot of the trees are all the same age, because the weather is warm and dry, it causes these pine bark beetles to just explode and eat like locusts all over everything. So they kill billions of conifer trees, pine trees, which makes them standing dead material, which is like the perfect fuel for fire outbreaks. there's a picture of the pine bark beetle. Okay. So that's everything I just said. We have even-aged plantation forests that are the perfect age for beetle infestation. The beetles don't die, so they wind up killing a lot more conifer trees. The dead ones are the brown. The idea of doing forestry sustainably is gaining ground. It's becoming more of a thing. There's an organization, a third-party organization called the Forest Stewardship Council that looks at practices of timber companies and rates them, or really any company that creates paper products. And I'll show you guys a couple pictures when we do the key points. And you can brag about sustainable forest certification if your methods are judged to be sustainable, literally from planting to harvesting to transporting to processing to transporting your materials to the store. So these are how you do it. The 10 principles of the Forest Stewardship Council certification, literally from beginning to end. I'm not going to test you guys on that, but it's just interesting to take a look at. So we can look at parks and protected areas as ways to preserve land. The national parks were in the United States, were the first in the world. This is one I need to get to, totally on my bucket list. Crater Lake National Park. It's a former volcano, Mount Mazama. So this is the regenerating volcano on the inside. Around the outside of Crater Lake was the sides of the actual volcano, and it blew its top and created a low spot, so water filled in. The 1906 Antiquities Act, I'm not going to test you on that, gave the president authority to declare certain public lands as national monuments. When Mount St. Helens erupted in 1980, Jimmy Carter then designated Mount St. Helens and the area affected by the blast a national monument. The National Park Service administers the 408 parks and monuments, and these are just some examples. Just beautiful, beautiful places. You could also have a National Wildlife Refuge. So as it says, it's a haven for wildlife. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service takes care of the refuges. You can't hunt fish for commercial use, right? You can take pictures, and environmental education is encouraged at these kinds of places. So 1964, Congress passed an act to allow areas to be wilderness areas. So it's off limits to development. You can't put, buildings and roadways and stuff, but you can hike and do other low impact public recreation, like non-motorized. So kayaking, canoeing, that kind of thing. Yeah, this is what we were talking about before. A lot of the western states, like Idaho, Oregon, and Utah, they control less than half of their own land. So that's problematic. The federal government keeps control. So if people go in and get resources from those forests or mine or anything like that, they don't get the profits from it. Or the federal government says, no, you can't do it, but the states say, hey, no, wait, this is our land. We want to let people do that. So that's problematic. And then indigenous people may have issues with land use. It might be contrary to their culture. So Devil's Tower in Wyoming is a really popular climbing spot, but Native Americans who live there don't think it should be. It's a sacred site for them. So that was all federal land use. Now we can talk about it at the state level. There are state parks in the United States, and then there are agencies within each state to manage those public lands. There are county parks and municipal parks too. There are private nonprofit groups that can buy land for preservation, creating something called a land trust. In Hunterdon County, we have a land trust. It's called the Hunterdon County Land Trust, and it's based in Flemington, right at the DeVore Farm. When you come down Route 12 into Flemington, it's right there. So they buy land for preservation. So there are some more famous ones. California's Big Sur, Jackson Hole in Wyoming, and Mount Desert Island in Maine. We are working to increase the parks and reserves. Typically, in developing countries, they don't have the funding that's needed to protect them from poaching. So even if it's a national park or a preserve, it's still susceptible to poaching. It's even gone international to the fact that the United Nations has set up some biosphere reserves that have a huge amount of biodiversity and some really good benefits for locals. The UN has also designated things called World Heritage Sites that have natural or cultural value and cross national borders. So the Mountain Gorilla Reserve, that incorporates parkland from Rwanda, Uganda, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. That's a United Nations globally recognized World Heritage Site. So one thing we're doing, we talked about this earlier on, is this idea of habitat fragmentation. We're taking this vast tract of taiga, okay, because it's British Columbia, so I know that's taiga. We're taking it and we're breaking it up. We're cutting roads through it like we talked with in the Serengeti. We put malls in some of these, okay? So it's taking these large tracts of habitat and breaking it into smaller disconnected ones. So when they're fragmented, if you have species that need large tracts of land, like the tiger, like the elephant, if you start to fragment that habitat, their niche is going to disappear because they need those large tracts of land. So then you see a decrease in biodiversity. There are issues with species that live on the edge between in those fragmented areas. They could be attacked by predators from the open areas, right? So the predators and the parasites from the open area, they have more open area, so they wind up becoming more aggressive and more opportunistic. So this is the theory of island biogeography. This was E.O. Wilson. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this in our key points, okay? So we can take a look at islands and see how the issues of biodiversity can be impacted. So it explains how the number of species on an island is the result of the balance between immigration of new species and others that are lost through extirpation, okay? So you look at an island's species richness, the amount of species that are there, based on the size of the island and the distance from the mainland. So what this graph tells you is that as the size of the island increases, okay, the number of species on the island increases too, which makes sense because you've got a more diverse variety of habitats that would then increase the number of niches, which would then support a greater number of species. To me, it makes sense. And it also talks about the distance of the island from the mainland, okay? So the further the island is away from the mainland, the fewer species tend to colonize it because it's harder to get there. So if you have a bigger island further away, you're going to have a greater number of species. Bigger island closer, you're going to have a greater number of species than a bigger island further away. We'll do a lab on this. It's pretty cool. So when it comes to determining how to set aside reserves and protected areas, there's two ways to approach the problem. Do you have a single large reserve, okay, or fewer numbers but bigger reserves? Or do you need to have a lot of small reserves that are smaller in area? They call that the SLOSS debate, single large or several small. And the bottom line is it depends on what you're trying to preserve. If you're trying to preserve insects or bacterial species, smaller organisms will do better in that smaller area. If you're trying to preserve like wildebeests that roam all over the place, you're definitely going to need fewer reserves, but definitely make them larger in size. So another thing that land managers use are these ideas of corridors, okay, to reduce that disconnectedness between islands of habitat, right? So if you're going to cut a road through the boreal forest, have a wildlife corridor to connect those two little islands. So climate change is wreaking havoc on a lot of our protected areas. Because the climates are warmer and drier, we are increasing the risk of wildfires. Climate change is intensifying droughts, floods, and storms. So the extremes are becoming the norm, and species are shifting towards cooler latitudes, right? So they're moving from equatorial regions north and south towards the poles. And they are increasing elevations because they're less tolerant of the changes in temperature, okay? So if you have an equatorial protected area that is now subject to climate change and temperatures are increasing and precipitation is increasing, those species aren't going to stay there. But if they move outside the protected zone, they're not protected anymore. So it's a little bit of a challenge. Climate change is posing a challenge for protecting species. Okay, so that ends the beginning of Unit 4.